Have you ever wondered what all these financial regulations mean? Spending caps, cost control, FFP and PSR, and wondered how Spurs fit into that along with their top six rivals, and to help circumnavigate this world of finance and simplify it all into something you can enjoy with a cup of tea is Gav, who is a business journalist. And of course, we have, coming back from the last two episodes, we have Nick, who works in corporate finance. We'll kick off with you, Gav. What are the UEFA cost control requirements? And if you're listening, effectively what we're saying is, what are the rules UEFA have for clubs when they're playing in the Champions League and Europa League around spending, to kind of add some kind of, you could call it a safety net, cap, whatever you want. Depends how you perceive why these rules exist. But Gav, over to you.
Fantastic. Yeah, so you've hit on the first thing, really, which is for all of the talk of financial fair play or sustainability, UEFA actually, their rules are not distinct to all of the other rules that they have within UEFA. So if you want to play as a licensed football club in a UEFA competition, you need to get your license, which means you have to apply a whole host of different rules and regulations, and they range from the requirement to have certain capacity for financial auditing of your club and the way you run your finances, but they also include loads of other rules, such as there is a requirement on all clubs playing in European football to have at least 4 different age groups of youth team, for example. So the financial rules are not a distinct document. They don't sit somewhere else. They are part of the license. You can simply not play in Europe if you don't abide by these rules. And the rules are called the cost control requirements, as you rightly said. And everyone by now has probably heard, quite simply, you're only allowed to spend 70% of whatever your revenue is on your team. But that slightly breaks down in a little sort of an odd way. Exactly what your revenue is depends on how you try to calculate it. And so UEFA specifies certain rules for that. And of course, what your team is kind of could be variable depending on your opinion. And so UEFA sets some rules for that. The important thing really to understand is that it all really comes down to 5 different pieces of information. And if you've got these 5 pieces of information, you can work out everything you need to know about UEFA's rules. Firstly, you will need to know your employee benefits expenses. So that is everyone who plays for your team fundamentally, plus managers. What do they earn? What are you paying in their pension fund? What are you paying for all of their other benefits? What are you paying on their taxes, etc.? It's all of that stuff. Everyone kind of understands that. It's just employment. It's quite straightforward. Getting hold of the figures might be difficult, but it's all there. The next thing on the list is amortization. Talk a lot about amortization because fundamentally amortization is a more important way of looking at this than transfers. It almost doesn't matter how much you spend in any given year. What matters is how much is still sitting on your books amortized. And what that means is if you buy a player for £50 million and they are on a 5-year contract, your figures actually say £10 million a year. They do not say £50 million in 1 year. And that's how the rules work. Pretty much all of these kinds of financial rules work that way. The UEFA ones do as well. And then I can't hear you, Jim. Sorry.
So just to clarify, those rules changed recently, right? Because a lot of people always use Chelsea as the example of, hey, but Chelsea keep getting away with spending all this money. But there used to be no cap on how many years you could amortize a contract because it was linked to how long the player's contract was. So if you put a player on a 10-year contract and something for £100 million, you could just take off £10 million a year would go towards your cap or your limit or whatever. And then recently, I think it was in the last 2 years, they've changed it last year even to be maximum of 5 years that you can amortize over, which kind of made it a little bit harder to spread your costs over a long period of times and kind of trick the system a bit like the likes of Chelsea were doing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually it's interesting because UEFA would argue potentially that they haven't changed that rule because they were trying to stop teams from cheating the system. They would argue probably that they changed that rule because the way Chelsea cheated the system was potentially very damaging to Chelsea Football Club long term in terms of its sustainability. Taking that level of risk on transfers by spreading them across 8, 9, 10 years on your books like that masks the cost of what you're doing. It means you're likely to still have significant sums to disappear from your books whenever you sell a player. It obviously, from their point of view in trying to establish rules that support sustainability, means that you've potentially got yourself saddled with some players who don't work out because inevitably some transfers don't, sucking cost out of your business, both in real terms because they were getting their wages, but in terms of your sort of sustainability planning, it'll be sucking out that amortized fee every time. So UEFA might reasonably argue they hadn't really imagined teams were going to take such a potentially risky route to try to get around the rules. And so naturally changed the rules to get rid of that risky route when a club in particular decided to.
Yeah, because ultimately these rules are, if you believe what people say, they're there to stop clubs going bankrupt if an owner is callous with their actions, or they, were to suddenly have to leave and they've been propping a club up with their own cash and suddenly leave for whatever reason. They need to make sure that club could sustain itself and all the employees and players and etc., etc. So that's what they say it is, but skeptics would say these rules are there to protect clubs in powerful positions, because it now makes it a longer term journey to bridge your spending cap with a bigger club with more revenue if you've got less revenue, because it's always framed around how much revenue you have at the top line, and the more revenue you have at the top line, the more you're allowed to spend under these rules, right?
Yeah, and whilst I'm sure UEFA would argue it was the former, they would definitely suggest that the reason they have rules requiring teams to have youth facilities and youth training schemes, the reason they require teams to have cost control measures in place is sustainability. Let's not overlook that at the time when Chelsea first, then Manchester City and PSG for a period were spending potentially vast sums beyond even the kind of the Real Madrid and Manchester United wildest dreams on transfers. There was a lot of talk among football fans, pundits, etc., about there being a problem for competition here and wanting to stop teams being able to do that for other reasons. So it's up to the viewers and to the listeners to decide which they think is the real reason. The important thing is the rules came in 3 years. They started to kick in. They started to kick in at first with a literally 100% limit. So you could spend literally every penny of revenue you had on your team costs, and then they've gradually brought it down. So this year it is 70%, and that's where it will stay.
Based on this, we can kind of lead into Nick, which is he's done the number crunching. So you can know now, based on these new rules, where are Spurs in this? Because not only Spurs, though, it's important to know where your competitors sit, because I think it's natural as fans to go, I want to see, I think the word that's often used to justify big spending versus conservative spending is ambition. And people will say, look what Aston Villa are doing. Shouldn't that be how all owners behave? Is there a drawback to that model, or should we just be more like them, aggressively using as much headroom as we can, whereas Spurs are probably on the other end of the spectrum, as we'll see soon, on the more risk-adverse side to these things?
Happy to take you through some numbers, Jin. So I think, look, from taking it back from a Tottenham perspective, look, headroom has never been Tottenham's problem. I think it's been well reported in the media in terms of what our wages to turnover ratio is, and the UEFA squad cost ratio that Gav took us through is almost a bit of a product of the wages to turnover ratios. There is something interesting, though, about what Gav said, is that 70% is almost like the compliance with UEFA in order to compete in a European competition. Tottenham need to be below 70%. Where they are below 70% is neither here nor there. They just need to be below 70. So the first thing is, where are Tottenham? Tottenham are currently, according to our calculations, at 49.1%. So there is a very healthy amount of headroom in where Tottenham are in terms of their squad cost ratio. The most interesting thing I think about this in terms of our competitors and the other clubs in European competitions. Now, by my accounting, I think there's 9 in total from the Premier League. So that's nearly 50%. I think that's a record. The makeup of these other clubs is quite remarkable. So out of these 9, you've got 5 clubs where they're comfortably within the threshold of 70%. Nothing to worry about. There's one club that I would say is kind of teetering and getting very close to that 70% number. And there are 3 clubs that are over that 70%. And so just for a recap, the 9 clubs that are in European competitions next season: Tottenham, Liverpool, Arsenal, City, Chelsea, Newcastle, Villa, Forest and Crystal Palace. And I think as well, at the time of recording, there's another problem for Palace in the sense that they may not be allowed to take part in the Europa League next season because one of their owners also is a majority shareholder of another club in France, I think Lyon. And of course, UEFA rules state that you cannot have one owner owning 2 clubs in the same competition. So that's one for us to keep an eye on, particularly if there's a few players at Crystal Palace that we might be interested to lure away, especially to entice them with European football. But anyway, so like we get back on track with Tottenham. So I think the main factor in lots of this is in terms of the turnover. So Tottenham's turnover actually in the last financial year, and the way that they assess it for the current season, so for 25-26 season, is they look at the most recent published accounts, which is our accounts from 2024. Our turnover was 528 billion. And that's in a season without European football as well. So let's compare that to Chelsea, who are a similar club in terms of size, stature, and where we've finished in the league comparative. And Chelsea didn't have any European football that season either. Their turnover was 469 million. So we are comfortably ahead of them in terms of 60 million ahead of them. Most of that, if not all, is purely down to the stadium and how we're able to use the stadium to generate additional revenue. So that's a huge bonus for us. The second part, though, of this of the income number is what our net profit is on player sales. So net profit, net profit isn't basically the sale of the player. It's basically like how much of the player sale minus the unamortized cost that on the balance sheet. So if I try and bring that to life for you, let's take a player that we bought recently, sold relatively recently. So I'm going to use Steven Bergwijn as an example. So we bought him in 2020 for 27 million. And then, as Gav mentioned, we amortise that fee over 5 years, which comes to around about 5.4 million. So hits the balance sheet 5 times each year. 5.4 million is what we owe. But then we sold him in 2022 for 28 million to Ajax. Quite a good deal at the time, I thought. But roughly speaking, there was about 10.8 million still owing on the balance sheet. So what we do is we subtract the 10.8 still owing from the 28 that we sold him for, and that's how we get to that net profit figure. You can remember in 2024, actually, we sold a few players, one of which Harry Kane, and so I think our net profit for that financial year was 82 million. That's higher than I think any time that we've had since about 2013. So quite an unusual year for us. But again, to compare that to Chelsea, their net profit was 153 million. So they are incredibly effective at selling players, especially academy players, for that net profit, which boosts their total income number that's used to assess what their costs are by income. So in terms of the costs, we've mentioned those a bit, as Gav mentioned. So total wages is what we see reported through each club's accounts is what the total wages are. But the actual regulations state that the total wages is only on the squad cost and the manager and coaching staff. So there's a proportion. So it won't include stewards or the guys that serve us behind the bar on the goal line bar, or it won't include the club secretary or the board members or anything like that. It's very hard to try and work out exactly what that figure is. UEFA did a report recently on their finance and landscape report, which said that for English clubs, it's roughly about 73% of their total wage bill relates to first team squad and coaches and managers. So we've used that 73% as a bit of an assumption, but we've applied it to all clubs. Now, it may be slightly higher, it may be lower, depending on various club situations, but we think that 73% is a reasonable assumption to get to. And then, of course, the other factor that goes into it is player amortization. So again, So Gav and I have spoken a little bit about that. You take the player, you divide the transfer fee over the length of the contract. Tottenham's amortization in 2024 was 136 million. So that's 136 million worth of players that we have purchased over the previous kind of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 years that's currently running on the balance sheet. Bit of a spoiler alert, next season when we report our accounts, we expect that to be higher. How that stacks up against other clubs, I mean, you've got some crazy numbers coming out of Chelsea. Chelsea's I think that's the highest one in the league. It's 190 million. Compared to City's is 165. Liverpool's is 115, so higher than Liverpool, slightly lower than City, a long way behind Chelsea, just as a for example. And then you have to include the other costs in there, things like player impairment, agents' fees. Now, agents' fees tends to get capitalised within the transfer fee. That's how most clubs will report it, and that gives us our overall total cost. So Tottenham's overall total cost in 2024 was 300 million. So the way that we get to 49% is to divide the 300 million by 611 million. To get us to 49.1.
So we're quite, when you look at that shows a position where it's means Spurs have room to offer players pay rises they want to keep, and they have a position to leverage even more capacity if they wanted to spend more money and they had the money to spend more. We're quite comfortable. We're out of those rivals in Europe. You're looking at Villa and Chelsea are in a position, and Palace are needing to cut, and Newcastle are probably on a situation where they need to just stay level. Spurs and City, can't believe you're saying if City have spent 500 million in 6 months or whatever the number is. they've got loads of wiggle room still as well, but their revenues are nearly £200 million more than ours a year, which is eye-watering amount of revenue that they generate through their sponsorships that are under review.
Exactly. So I think out of the 9 clubs that we've got in there, the ones that are a little bit boring that we wouldn't really want to pay much attention to is like Liverpool, Arsenal, City and us, really, because we're all kind of very similar. I mean, Liverpool, Arsenal and City have had the benefit in their accounts of having Champions League football for the last couple of years. So they will naturally see some higher levels of turnover, and also they will see they've been able to invest more in both in wages and in transfers. So that's why their amortization bill is slightly higher. For me, one of the weirdest ones out of all of them is Chelsea. I mean, Chelsea's squad to cost ratio is 70.3%. So they're outside of compliance with this regulation, and it almost feels like they've tried to plan their accounts based on these regulations. They're not so worried about their cash flow. They're just trying to take it up to the limits. I mean, if you think about, the speed limit on a motorway is 70 miles an hour, and Chelsea are trying to hit that 70 miles an hour constantly. So Liverpool, Arsenal and City, they're not so worried about that. Broadly speaking, they're in a very similar position to what we're in. The huge outlier in all of this is Aston Villa. For the life of me, can't really work out what they're doing. I think that what I would say Aston Villa have done is they're almost doing an Everton. So Everton spent like a Champions League club in the pursuit of Champions League football, and they never quite got there. And that's why they've got all these problems further down the track and nearly went bankrupt. That's why they've had the points deductions and things like that. And Villa are on exactly an almost identical path. I mean, their UEFA squad cost ratio is currently 82%. They have negative 42 million headroom in order to invest in their squad if they want to be compliant with UEFA's rules. And it's a long way back for them. They don't have the benefit. I mean, they're in the Europa League next season, as long as UEFA allow them in with their accounts. They don't have the ability to generate a lot of extra income like Tottenham do, for example. If they really want to move ahead, the only option that they've really got is that they need to sell players and they need to raise some money quickly. And they've been doing some odd things. Like if anyone's that interested and look back to last summer, there was a lot of trading going on between Villa, Newcastle and Chelsea, player trading. And if I'm being generous, I would say that's because each of those clubs were all interested in one another's players and thought that they had players that could improve their playing squad. But if you're looking at it just purely from a data and numbers perspective, I would say those 3 clubs were trying to help one another out in trying to boost their overall balances on the balance sheet and to look far better from an accounting perspective in terms of PSR and everything else.
There is something to flag up here, and obviously from a journalistic point of view, whenever you're focusing on a story, you tend to focus quite heavily on the one bit of the story that you're interested in or you think people are interested in, and it can be a little bit easy to gloss over the other things. What's remarkable about the Aston Villa accounts is that I have assumed for the most part that 70% squad cost as a ratio has presumably been arrived at because it's reasonable to run the rest of your business with 30%-ish of whatever your revenue is likely to be.
Yeah, expenses, day-to-day expenses for running a football club.
Electricity, capital costs, all the sorts of things that everyone has to pay. And of course, you've got a huge number of staff who have to run things who are not footballers. But they've been left with effectively about 17.5% of revenue left to pay for everything. It's the potential for running up losses and getting into significant financial trouble, quite aside from the rules, feels quite significant.
This is what the thing is important to distinguish the differences between. These rules are not a representation of how healthy your cash flow is in any shape. You could have a great score on, well, the difference between the UEFA rules and the ones that people will see for the Premier League, there's one major difference I think we need to flag, huge one. There's loopholes open because people are saying, surely Villa could just sell themselves their women's team like Chelsea did or whatever. In UEFA, those rules are blocked. So yes, Chelsea are out of the mud for PSR, which is the rules you use for the Premier League situation. So they're fine there, but they are in breach of their UEFA rules, these ones. So there's a discussion going on what that punishment will be. You can't get out of it from that perspective. But if you looked at PSR, you'd go, whoa, Chelsea are clear. They've got the most headroom in the league. They're all in the green everywhere. If you look underlying, they're making big losses from a cash flow perspective because they're pumping up, with their own money. So they're spending money to make themselves look healthier with their own money. So it's not actually a sign of how healthy you are technically from a business perspective at all. And for Spurs, I know people will say, put your hands in your pockets, Daniel Levy, and, juice this machine up. Daniel Levy's not a billionaire. He doesn't have £100 million in his bank account. If he did, I don't think he'd use it all on this either. But we do have a billionaire in Joe Lewis, but his assets, and it's probably for a different pod, but he's primarily a big asset holder, his trust. He's not a highly liquid individual. And when you're competing with Chelsea's, when you've got groups of billionaires putting all their cash into a fund together so we can leverage these kind of mechanisms, they can manipulate it to try and pump Chelsea up and sell it for more. It's a very different kind of model. So people will say, can Spurs not do what Villa are doing? Can Spurs not do what Newcastle are doing? There's such different ownership models throughout this tree here. It's very hard to kind of take one and put it up against the other of what's sustainable for one club to do and another one to do, right?
Yeah, and I would imagine, just from a business point of view, some of the clubs will have very different kind of non-squad cost sort of balances. But the fact is that, it's great that Spurs make money out of doing some very big events at the stadium that aren't football, and that's good. That's adding money for Tottenham, right? That's what we as Tottenham fans hope will then be spent on players, etc. But we also have to bear in mind that running a big event for Beyonce also costs money, in a way that signing up a new sponsor for £5 million for putting some logos on your website does not cost lots of money. No, that's it. Just doesn't. So there's kind of how much it's costing you to run your business and bring all your revenue in and so on will vary significantly, probably between clubs. But it did. The thing that struck me looking at some of those numbers that you did, Nick, is at least one of those clubs. I, as a fan, if I was a fan of their club, as someone who has reported on companies going bust over the years, would feel very uncomfortable that it would only take for them to suddenly not have a particularly generous owner for whatever reason, and they would be in serious trouble.
We do also need to, I think, and something that Spurs have done is they've built their whole business model around these rules to be better set up to be competitive within them without having to leverage loopholes and do other things. But I think we have to also weigh out there's different perspectives of how you look at this rules based on which club you support, based on your situation. If you are a Villa or a Newcastle, you're saying, who cares if a billionaire, trillionaire estate want to throw their own cash at us? Let them have fun. Let them buy Mbappe and chuck him into Villa Park. It'll be good for us as fans. It adds competition. It's a way of disrupting the status quo a bit. It's all about entertainment at the end of the day. Whereas I think as a Spurs fans, we're going to say, hang on a sec. We didn't spend any money for 18 months building this stadium so we could have the benefit of larger revenues and kind of have that advantage over you in future seasons. And then there's all these different ways you can argue whether these rules are good or bad. But I'd say for Spurs, because of how we've built our model to go into these rules probably do us more good than harm when we look at how we are trying to remain competitive with those other teams on the sheet. Right?
Yeah, that's right. What Gav said there about if you were a fan of one or two of these clubs, you'd probably have some concerns. I'd agree completely with that. If I was a fan of Aston Villa, I would be worried, mainly because if you think that the money that Villa are generating is roughly about 276 million a year. So that's pretty much half of what Tottenham are able to generate. Their wages, total club wages, is 252 million. So the expenses that you have of your personnel is nearly as much as the money that you make. Anybody that runs a business, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners do, Jim, anyone that runs business, that would probably make it would probably make them incredibly worried, and that they would hate to operate a business like that where they have very little wiggle room or margin for error. The other thing that we should mention with Aston Villa is for 2024, they actually changed their accounting period by 1 month. So it allowed them 13 months rather than 12. And they were able to bring in more revenue at that as well. So their accounts look even better by virtue of the fact that they've extended their accounting period by 1 month, or rather, not extending, but they changed it, which any club is entitled to do so. So if we wanted to, so we run from the 1st of July to the 30th of June every single year. If this year, for example, we wanted to run our accounts from, say, June to July the next year, we could do so. But we don't need to. And I would always be highly skeptical of any club that's looking to get an extra month's worth of an extra month's worth of accounts in their annual accounts as well. The other one that's, I mean, we've mentioned, like I said at the top, there's 5 clubs that are absolutely fine. So we haven't mentioned Forest. Forest FFP troubles and had a points deduction. We actually think they're going to be fine. Squad cost ratio is about 63%. Again, their turnover is one of the lowest of all the clubs competing in Europe. So joint lowest with Palace at 190 million. But what they've been more effective at is selling players. One of those players, obviously, Brennan Johnson, who came to us. And so they've been able to kind of offset the shortfall that what they make in terms of revenue with player trading. And so they look like they're going to be absolutely fine. Palace is probably the more interesting one because lovely story on a personal level. I was really impressed with Crystal Palace this season, watching them play. You know, like they remind me a lot of some of the North American international teams like Canada and the USA in that they are big, powerful, almost like track and field athletes. And that's almost a bit of a trend that we've started to see in the Premier League this season. They're clearly a club that we're not expecting to get into Europe anytime soon, because if you look at, their squad cost ratio is 75%. So again, they're non-compliant with UEFA's rules, and the vast majority of that, they're not going mad in terms of their spend. They're not selling. They're not. Their player trading is relatively low. Like they only made 1 million in 2024 in terms of player trading, which is just almost like a rounding error on a balance sheet. And their player amortization and wages is relatively modest. Absolutely fine to operate in the Premier League that way. But if you want to move up into that tier of European football, more of a challenge.
There is one additional little thing to the rules that's probably worth bearing in mind on that, which is that within all of this, there is that slightly odd phrase, allowable losses, which in pretty much any other world of business would mean absolutely nothing. And people would wonder what on earth you were aiming to make losses for. But in the Premier League, obviously, we have allowable losses over a 3-year period. Those allowable losses are restricted to, I think, if I remember rightly, £1 million. And
That's
that
right,
then also has to be backed by some sort of capital injection by the owners. For UEFA, the equivalent figure is only 60 million, so it's lower. So again, UEFA's rules are a lot tighter, frankly, than Premier League equivalent rules.
And I have to, and you can speculate as to why. A skeptic might say that helps protect the Premier League's biggest shiny asset in Manchester City. A non-skeptic, but to be fair, I'd say all rules are voted on by all 20 Premier League clubs. Everyone has an equal share, and you need a majority to make rules changes. And if the majority are happy with they are, that's better for the majority of clubs. So be it. Fair enough. If we win some, we lose some on there.
I don't know if you want to mention the recent failure to vote on whether it's okay to sell your women's team for a massive price.
So that was it. There was 2 things, actually. So one rule that you have to tell me, guys, I'm not sure if it exists in here or not, but we mentioned before as well, like you can't sell yourself to your other assets like hotels and clubs in the UEFA rules and get away with it, but you can in the Premier League. But another rule that actually benefits Spurs in these regulations in the Premier League rules, I'm not sure exists on here, is Spurs can use the depreciation of their stadium as a way of having a bigger headroom under PSR, right? Because they can what we can say as Spurs is we say the stadium's worth $1 billion, say. So what we're saying is it becomes worth 100 million less every year. And then they can use that to offset it as a cost effectively. So that allows them to say, actually, we may have spent 200 million, we may be over our spending limit, but actually 100 million pounds we lost for our stadium becoming less valuable drops us down to 100 million pounds. So it's a way Spurs can use that. And that's when people see Spurs' headroom, I think, under the Premier League rules, the PSR rules, you'll see Spurs are like, whoa, Spurs have got 292 million pound headroom. But there's a huge amount of that is due to depreciation of the stadium that makes it look like it kind of changes the numbers a bit. If you look at the underlying cash flow of Spurs at the moment, it's not terrible, but it's not strong either, I think was our conclusion, right, guys? It's
Agreed, yeah. I mean, so we're throwing around a lot of numbers, and it is very difficult for everyone to keep up because there is a different headroom for PSR, there is a different headroom for the UEFA squad cost ratio, and then there's all-important cash flow. So again, if we go back to our plumber or our electrician who runs their own company, their company will run on cash flow, like most businesses do. And that's the thing I would always bring it back to in terms of cash flow. So if you think about the total cash that Tottenham brought in, and we can just go through it quickly now. So we've already mentioned turnover was 528 million. Player sales, so total player sales was 109 million. And so that gives us like 637 million that Tottenham had in terms of cash coming in throughout the course of the season 2023-2024. But we also had to pay everyone's wages. So not just the players, we have to pay the wages of all of the people that work at Tottenham. There's an estimate that we've got something like 800 full-time, part-time employees at Tottenham. You know, there's a lot of employees at Tottenham. Total bill in 2024 was 222 million. So that immediately comes off that figure of 637 million. Then we've got our operating expenses. So running the stadium, like electricity, gas. We've got the fact that you need to run a training ground, all of the food that you have to buy, all of the staff, like the chefs and things like that work with the club, the travel costs of going to different places all over the country. So those day-to-day runnings of a football club last year were 159 million. So we have to take those off. And then, of course, the all-important thing is, how many players are you buying? What's the value of the players that we traded? In 2024, obviously, we spent 252 million or 253 million on players, we believe. Adding up all of those costs that we've incurred is 634 million. So once you take 634 million off of 637 million, you're left with about £3 million. That's all that's left over in terms of Tottenham's cash flow. And that 3 million, you might say, well, that's 3 million extra that we could have spent on, I don't know, we could have spent it on wages, or we could have reduced our season ticket prices or anything like that. That 3 million is so insignificant. I mean, it's almost like an exchange rate rounding issue. So if, for example, we do a lot of player trading in euros, we have to convert that to sterling as well. If those amounts then change, like if the exchange rate changed from 0.84 to 0.85, for example, there's all of those things that those little adjustments will account for. So Tottenham, I mean, the headline really is Tottenham are spending as much as what they are making.
Right, guys, I think we will wrap up there because numbers take a while to digest, and we've got many more episodes to come to break this down to micro sessions because, there's just so much to unpack in each episode. But I hope that gives everyone a nice overview of where we sit as a club in terms of these cost control frameworks and from a cash flow perspective, why we're in a position not to really leverage all of that headroom that we have right now. And that might be why Spurs are seeking, external investment to help them so they can get there. But thank you so much, Gav, and thank you so much, Nick. And up the Spurs.
Come on, you Spurs.
Up the Spurs.
You sick podcasts and football shows that are just a bunch of people spouting opinions with no substance. It's always toxic negativity. It's toxic positivity. There's no substance. You don't come out of it feeling like you've learned anything new. Well, that's why we created Oh So Spurs. It's the Thinking Fans podcast. I'm Jim, and I'm the host. But I am only a sum of many brilliant parts. We have A-licensed coaches like JJ to help us dissect how games changed and how coaches are adapting. We have people who work in finance to tell us how much can Spurs actually spend and why we don't leave it all down to opinions when we discuss these things. We always look for the facts. We go and search long and hard to find people who've actually worked at Spurs. We talk to ex-coaches from Tottenham. We talk to ex-coaches from players we've recently signed to get you a deeper level look into them than you're going to get on a typical show on the internet. But we depend on our members to get this kind of content. To raise the bar and provide you with higher quality content, we need to find a revenue stream that is sustainable for us. And that is where you come in as members. You are the lifeblood of our show. We all do this for free as members of the show, and we need the money to survive and keep it running. So if you would like to be a member, we will promise you back an extra 2 videos per week as a minimum, and first access to our daily videos that come out as well, alongside other things like access to our WhatsApp groups where you will find those 8 licensed coaches and those finance experts and the rest of the panel to have a chat to about Spurs. So welcome to the show, and I hope you get all you're looking for and you like to stick around. Up the Spurs.